Sit back and listen to this extremely interesting story. This is a story about a tense couple who got involved in their neighbor's marriage. It includes themes of femdom, blackmail, humiliation, manipulation, and betrayal, though most of it starts in PT2. If that's not for you, it's best to move on. Thanks for inviting us over, Andy said. He and Abby had just arrived at Dean and Jenna's home, which was right next door to their own home in which they'd lived for 10 years, since their daughter had been just 9 years old. Their new neighbors had moved in a little over a month ago, but until today they'd only spoken in passing. "Glad you made it," Jenna said in a hoarse voice. It reminded Andy Demi Moore. He tried not to look, but he was always drawn to the bad girl look, and Jenna embodied that. Her dark hair was cut shoulder length, accentuating her slender neck, and her hazel eyes shone like a fox watching its prey. She was wearing short shorts with a short cut and a tight tank top. Andy was mesmerized by the many tattoos that adorned her arms and shoulders. Another pattern in black ink was visible from under her shorts, looking like the tail of a dragon or some sort of phoenix. Only in appearance she was almost the complete opposite of his wife. Abby was slightly taller at 5'9", but had long straight blonde hair and milky white skin with no tattoos. She was beautiful, no doubt about it, but it was a more wholesome beauty in contrast to Jenna's raw magnetism. Dean gave the couple a beer each. They agreed, but Andy shot Abby a worried look. She either didn't notice, or at least pretended not to notice. Abby always flirted when she drank, and especially in the beginning of their marriage. Sometimes it seemed to Andy that it crossed the line. If he was honest with himself, he thought there was a time shortly after their marriage when she might have spent time with someone else, maybe even more than once, but he had no evidence, so he never challenged her. What he did know for sure was that before they were married, Abby loved to party and was pretty frivolous, though she rarely talked about it. Now that they were married and had a daughter in college, she was mostly settled in her quiet and comfortable marriage. But every now and then, when she drank, Andy saw hints of her wilder side threatening to resurface. They continued chatting into the evening, eventually making their way inside when it started to cool down. They sat down on the sofa. Abby picked up a photo album from the coffee table and opened it. Not many people had physical photo albums anymore, and she thought it was cute that they liked to keep their most prized memories someplace that they could be celebrated. As Abby slowly thumbed through pages, she found herself drawn to photos of the beautiful couple. In what Abby assumed were earlier photos, Jenna didn't have as many tattoos and her hair had been longer, but Abby thought she was even more beautiful now. A soft gasp escaped Abby's lips as she turned another page and saw a photo of Jenna, Dean, and a third woman standing on the beach. Dean was in the middle, putting an arm around each girl and a big smile on his face. The women laughed and each had a hand on Dean. Abby felt a rush of excitement as she looked at the photo. She regained her composure and quickly turned the page. She glanced at Dean, hoping he hadn't noticed what she saw. So she began, "What do you like to do for fun?" Abby asked innocently enough, but suddenly regretted her question. Ever since they moved in, their new neighbors have been rumored to have possibly had some kind of open marriage arrangement. Tales of their antics seemed to be buzzing around the neighborhood and seemed to grow more salacious and less believable as the weeks went by. While there may be hints of truth to some of them, both Abby and Andy were convinced that the stories were probably made up. Dean smiled and took a sip of his drink. "Well, we've been together for 8 years. We're probably just enjoying life." Noticing Abby's nervousness, he smiled and looked at Gina. "You must have heard some of the stories. I'm sure they're exaggerated, but it's true that Jenna and I decided early on that monogamy wasn't for us. We enjoy exploring our other sides together, and it brings us closer together." Jenna nodded and smiled as she wrapped her arm around Dean, her thin shirt drawing attention. Andy tried not to look. Abby blushed and looked down at her hands, feeling suddenly intimidated by Dean. Not in a negative way, but the way he looked at her made her feel shy as a schoolgirl. His confident demeanor and muscular build made her heart race. She tipped her beer and finished it off. "So," Dean remarked, breaking the silence, "what do you guys feel like doing?" "Not sure. What did you have in mind?" Andy asked, happy to change the subject. He noticed Jenna had handed Abby another beer. Dean grinned slyly. "Well, I'm not sure," he replied. "Something fun. Maybe a little naughty, if you guys are up for it." Andy almost spit out his mouth full of beer. Sorry, man," he said nervously. "Abby and I aren't into." He looked at his wife, then back to Dean and Jenna. "Well, we aren't that adventurous, I mean. We aren't open to sharing if that's what you had in mind," Andy said nervously, hoping he didn't sound like he was judging them. Dean laughed. Easy, big guy. I wasn't suggesting we all strip down and head to the bedroom. He chuckled. How about just a little game to get to know each other better? But something a little naughty. I mean, we are adults. He laughed disarmingly. But nothing like what you're worried about, Andy, I promise. Sure, we're in. Abby spoke up, her excitement evident. Andy looked over at his wife, his eyes wide. She had been awfully quick to accept, and neither of them knew exactly what Dean had in mind yet. He watched her take a long drink of her beer and gave him a shrug and a smile. Okay, great. Well, we recently got a fun card game. Let's try it out. I will go grab it. Dean got up and headed down the hallway. He glanced at Abby, sensing her growing eagerness. She licked her lips nervously, her eyes gleaming as she watched Dean return with the deck of cards. Okay, Andy agreed hesitantly. So how does this game work? Dean sat down and opened the box of cards. Simple. Everyone takes turns drawing cards and asking the question to the person on their right. The cards are a little racy to make it fun, and if you refuse to answer a question or the rest of the group boo your answer for being too boring, then you have to perform a dare. Andy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing a storm brewing beneath the surface of this seemingly innocent game. He looked at his wife and realized that she had finished her second drink and was now on her third. Andy tried to catch her eyes, to signal her to pace herself. Abby caught Andy's gaze and offered him a reassuring smile, though her eyes betrayed the excitement burning within her. Dean cleared his throat and began to shuffle the cards expertly before sitting them face down at the center of the table. Who's first? He asked, smiling broadly. I'll go. Abby blurted with a giggle. Dean sat down to her left, so he took the card and read it to her. Tell us about the most complete vacation you've ever taken. Abby thought for a moment before appearing to settle on a memory. She giggled shyly and began to recount a trip to Hawaii she had taken with some girl, friends years ago, laughing as she recalled the adventures they had shared. There had been a bonfire on a beach, and there was a group of guys from a local rugby team hitting on them and feeding them drinks. She suddenly paused and glanced at Andy nervously. Andy looked at her curiously, waiting for her to continue her story. Anyhow, I guess we all got a little tipsy and maybe flirted a bit too much, Abby said nervously. I don't remember too much after that. It was evident to everyone that Abby had left out the best part of the story, obviously for fear of upsetting her husband. Boo, Jenna jeered. Let's hear the rest of the story, Abby. Don't leave us hanging. Abby took a drink of her beer and glanced at Dean, then Andy. I really don't remember. I probably just passed out. Suo, you're ready to perform a dare? Dean asked with a wide grin. Huh. Abby looked at him confused, then suddenly remembered the rules he'd outlined at the start of the game. Leave her be. Jenna came to her rescue. We will give you a pass, this time. She teased and rubbed Abby's leg playfully. Abby quickly picked up a card and read it for Jenna. Jenna, have you ever had a threesome? Do you mean today? Jenna asked, trying to hide a grin. Abby and Andy looked at each other, then back to Jenna. No. Abby said slowly, unsure if Jenna was serious. I think it just means if you've ever had one. Jenna laughed out loud. I know. Yes, I had a threesome, Abby, and much more, she said, leaning closer as if to share a secret. You want to know the most people I've ever spent time with at one time? Abby's cheeks turned red. She swallowed hard, wondering if Jenna was serious about telling them. She felt her heart racing and realized what she really wanted to know. Was she really spending time with more than 2 other people at the same time? It sounded so foreign to Abby, but she could feel her whole body shaking with anticipation and excitement at the thought of it. Jenna laughed and picked up a card. Maybe I will tell you sometime. She winked at Andy. Okay, Andy, ready for your question? Asked Jenna, her smile widening as she read the card to herself. Oh, yay, I think so, he said. Name the thing your wife does or has done that worries you the most, Jenna asked. Andy's heart was pounding as he tried to think. His and Abby's married life was great, or at least it was. He had to admit that he had definitely lost his strength over the last year or so. He sat in silence, but he didn't really need time to come up with an actual answer. What worried him most was that Abby had only done it a few times since he'd known her, and only when she was really drunk. He wasn't even sure if he'd ever told her what it was, and now he was debating whether to admit it to the whole group. He swallowed hard and finally spoke. Well, I guess when she smokes I find it attractive, he said, glancing nervously from Abby to Jenna, then back to Abby before finally settling on the bottle in front of him. He picked it up and took a swig of beer. What, really? Abby exclaimed, looking genuinely shocked. Andy guessed he must not have mentioned it to her after all, or perhaps he had, but she was drunk and didn't remember. He wasn't even sure. Andy saw Jenna and Dean exchange a smile, eager to hear more. Yay, Andy answered, trying to sound casual. I told you that before, didn't I? He asked. Ooh, no, Abby stated, clearly surprised. Why do you like it? Andy shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, it just does, I guess. Maybe makes you seem less uptight or more rebellious. I'm honestly not sure, it just does. Andy could feel all eyes on him, and though the silence probably lasted just a few seconds, it felt like forever. Hey, I don't think that's weird at all, Dean said. It can be beautiful when an attractive girl smokes, right, baby? He looked at Gina with a smile. Jenna winked at him and blew a kiss. Andy appreciated the bailout. He picked up a card and read it to Dean, pretending not to notice that Abby was still looking at him with a mix of surprise and curiosity. What is your least favorite intimate position? He asked. Easy, Dean responded. Missionary, too boring, even the name suggests as much. He laughed. Ready for another drink, Abby? Jenna asked. Abby looked at her drink and realized there was only mouthful left. Sure, she said and finished off what was left. How about we take a quick break? Jenna suggested. I'm going to go outside for a smoke. Abby, care to join me? She glanced at Andy and gave him a wink. Yay, okay. She hesitated. I will come outside and keep you company at least. Andy watched the girls grab 2 more beers from the fridge before slipping out the patio door to the backyard. He suddenly felt uneasy with just him and Dean left in the room, ready for another one. Dean asked as he started for the kitchen. Andy got up and followed him. Yay, sure, he said and leaned against the island counter. Dean handed him one and they both took a long drink. Andy gazed out the patio doors into the dark. The room was quiet other than the faint sounds of the girls giggling outside. Dean seemed to sense Andy's discomfort. Should we go out and join the girls? He asked. Andy shrugged, finding himself relieved at the suggestion. He wasn't sure why he felt so uncomfortable around Dean without Abby and Jenna present. He seemed a little arrogant to Andy, although he wondered if it was more about Andy feeling insecure around someone as manly as Dean. He appeared to have everything going for him, and perhaps Andy just felt a bit of jealousy. As they stepped out onto the patio, Abby and Jenna burst into laughter, apparently amused by whatever stories they were sharing. They were sitting on the outdoor swing, each smoking a cigarette. Andy's heart skipped as he watched his wife take a drag from the cigarette and slowly exhaled. Although he had only witnessed it 2 or 3 times, watching his wife smoke always gave him a hidden excitement that he never fully understood but couldn't deny. The way her lips pursed and the smoke curled around her face, everything was so sensual. As they approached, Andy watched her take another drag and hesitated before blowing the smoke out the corner of her mouth, her eyes carefully watching Andy. She grinned and turned her attention back to her conversation with Jenna. Andy felt his pulse quicken as he watched his wife indulge in this naughty habit, and he shifted uncomfortably, trying to adjust so that no one would notice his excitement. He looked at Dean and realized he too was watching Abby with hungry eyes. Andy felt a sudden pang of jealousy, but quickly pushed it away. It was hard to blame Dean for appreciating how attractive Abby looked. So Dean, what's the craziest thing you've done while you were drunk? Abby challenged, apparently still caught up in the spirit of the game. Dean chuckled and took a sip of his drink. Well, that could be a lot of things. I guess it depends on your definition of crazy, but there was one time in Cancun that got kind of crazy, I guess. We met this friendly, attractive couple at a club and ended up back at their place. It turned into a pretty wild night. Jenna could barely walk. Right the next day, he smiled, his eyes locked on Abby. Andy could see he was trying to shock her. He watched her meet Dean's gaze, her cheeks flushed as she took another drag from the cigarette, holding the smoke just a moment longer until she blew it out in a thin stream. Andy felt a knot in his stomach. Abby seemed to be captivated by Dean, her eyes lingering way too long on their neighbor as he laid on his charm. Oh, really? Abby managed to ask, trying to maintain a light-hearted tone despite the sudden knot in her stomach. What happened? Well, you'll have to use your imagination, Dean replied with a sly grin. He glanced at Jenna, whose sultry eyes met his. You probably don't want to hear all the raunchy details. Andy could feel his heart pounding as he imagined the scene, his mind conjuring up vivid images that made him worry. He tried to shake the feeling, but alcohol and smoking excited him more than he remembered. Jenna leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Or maybe she does. She teased. Abby's eyes widened, and she couldn't deny the surge of excitement that shot through her veins. She found herself longing to know more about this mysterious couple and their daring exploits. "Sounds like a pretty crazy time," Andy chimed in nervously. He saw the look in Abby's eye and suddenly wanted to end this conversation. She appeared to hang on to Dean's every word, eager for more details. "It was," Jenna beamed, winking at Dean. "Like an adult movie, really." Jenna smiled mischievously. "But we're all adults here, right?" She stared at Abby, forcing her to keep up. Andy's jealousy continued to boil over, but he was also painfully aware of his rapidly growing excitement. "How about you two?" Dean asked, shifting his gaze back and forth between Andy and Abby. "What's the wildest thing you've ever done together?" Abby and Andy exchanged furtive glances. "Like I said earlier, I don't think we are two," Andy started before Abby cut him off. "Sometimes we watch adult movies together. You know, to get bored before talking," she said, clearly drunk at the moment. "It probably isn't exactly wild to you guys, but I think it's intriguing, and Andy is really excited about it." "Oh, really?" Dean asked. "And what movie do you like to watch together?" Abby's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Well, you know." She was clearly enjoying Dean's attention. Andy tried to interject, but Dean held up his hand, signaling for him to remain silent. "No, I don't know," Dean said, his voice low and intense. "Why don't you tell us?" Abby hesitated for a moment, then took another drag from her cigarette. She was treading into uncharted territory here, but something about Jenna and Dean made her feel emboldened. "Well, for starters, the three of us like to hang out." She giggled, then quickly explained. "I mean watching them, don't have them. I mean, it's not like the three of us had sex, so I wouldn't know. But I meant to watch them." Andy's heart skipped a beat, and he shot her a warning look. They had never discussed their private fantasies with anyone but each other, and here she was, spilling their guts to their new neighbours. "Ooh, two girls having their way with a guy. That is hot." Dean smiled, his eyes fixed on Abby. Andy turned quickly to his wife, but before he could stop her, she corrected Dean. "Oh no, not two girls. 2 boys and 1 girl, she announced. Andy nearly choked on his beer. In fact, usually we try to find ones where a husband and wife invite another man into their home. Abby blurted out the words before she could stop herself, unable to control the wave of her own inappropriate thoughts or the intoxicating effects of the alcohol. "Abby," Andy hissed, closing his eyes in embarrassment. And Abby continued with a giggle. "Andy likes wild girls. He tries to find ones where the wife has lots of tattoos and orders the husband around. He thinks tattoos are hot, don't you, hun?" She smiled. She was either unaware of Andy's embarrassment or reveling in it. Andy couldn't be sure. "Oh, tattoos like mine?" Jenna asked with a devilish smile. Andy swallowed hard. "Yay, I guess so," he managed. "Okay, I think we should probably get going." Andy laughed awkwardly. "Are you sure, Andy?" Jenna teased. "We're just getting to know each other, and besides, it's still early." Yay," he stammered. "I think we should head home for tonight. I think I've had a few too many. How about you, hun?" Andy looked to his wife, his eyes pleading. The mood had shifted from playful to suggestive, and he wasn't quite sure how to navigate these new waters. To make things worse, his wife had obviously had too much to drink, and he wasn't sure what may come out of her mouth next. Abby looked disappointed. "I guess," she said, glancing at Dean, "if that's what you want." As they gathered their belongings and said their goodbyes, Andy knew he had thrown cold water on their evening. It had just been harmless banter, really, but he had become more jealous as the evening went on, and Abby's increasing state of intoxication had him worried about where the evening might lead. Perhaps he was overreacting, but there was no denying the frequent glances and suggestive smiles between Abby and Dean. Honestly, though, he said as they started toward the fence gate that separated their backyards, "It was a fun night. We should do it again sometime." Abby nodded in agreement, absently twirling a strand of hair around her finger as she stole a glance at Dean. "It's a date, then," Jenna chimed in, a hint of mischievousness in her voice. "I will give you a call sometime this week, Abby, and we can set something up." Andy hesitated, but the excitement in Abby's eyes and the anticipation building in his own chest was almost too much to deny. "Sounds good," he conceded, a small twinge of apprehension gnawing at the back of his mind. When Andy and Abby arrived back home, Andy watched his wife head straight for the refrigerator where she retrieved another beer. She cracked it open and took a long swig. Andy watched her carefully, trying to gauge her mood. He sensed she may be upset with him for cutting their evening short. He approached his wife, trying to think of what to say. She took another large gulp of her beer and set it on the counter. Before he could say anything, Abby turned around and grabbed him, kissing him, the taste of beer and tobacco mixing, turning him on instantly. She pressed herself against him. Andy moaned softly, his hands instinctively moving to wrap around her waist through her jeans. Abby giggled, pulling away briefly to lock the front door. "Let's go upstairs," she whispered hoarsely. Andy followed closely behind her, his heart pounding in his chest. They stepped onto the carpeted stairs, Abby leading him to their bedroom. In Andy's head, the provocative conversations that happened earlier began to spin, turning into a powerful mixture of decadence and fantasy. The visions of Jenna and her tattooed body look incredibly enticing. Both she and Abby smoke and how much it turned him on. He thought about the story his wife had started to tell about her vacation with her friends, but cut the story short when she got to the part about meeting a group of rugby players. The mere thought of Abby surrounded by a group of eager jocks on some tropical island consumed his thoughts. I think I need to do it now," Abby teased. Her blue eyes danced with playful mischief. Her attractive and intriguing invitation caused him a rush of adrenaline. It was much more forward than he was used to from his wife. He ran his fingers through her silky hair, almost gasping as she began to please him. He tried to keep his thoughts grounded in reality, worried that he might lose control if he allowed himself to get too far into the fantasies running through his mind. He grabbed his wife by the shoulders and lifted her to her feet, afraid to get pleasure before her. Abby shed her clothes in seconds, throwing them haphazardly around the room as Andy kicked off his jeans and wrestled with the rest of his clothes. They fell on the bed. Abby grabbed Andy and held him close. They spent time together. Andy was pretty intense. The thoughts of that tropical island and the rugby players rushed back into his mind. He didn't know what had happened, but his imagination was running wild. "Oh my God, Abby," he moaned, the images fueling his excitement. "You feel so good." His hands gripped her tighter. He became more and more insistent. "Harder, baby," she encouraged him, her own voice growing ragged with pleasure. Andy needed no further encouragement. He obeyed her order. Andy could see her eyes closed tight and wondered what she was imagining. Did she think about Andy and how much pleasure he was giving her right now? Or her thoughts were elsewhere, driven by the mature topics they had shared earlier in the evening? He could not get rid of the ideas that were planted in his head. Maybe she was picturing Dean, the muscular neighbor, hanging out with her. The thought of his sweet Abby with someone else made Andy commit even more to the process. "Yes, baby, yes," Abby murmured, her voice full of pleasure. A bead of sweat ran down Andy's forehead as he felt his pleasure quickly approaching. In the midst of it all, Abby's own pleasure crept up on her. Her toes curled as she arched her back, and a soft moan escaped her lips. "Oh, baby, I'm close," Andy warned, sweat dripping from his forehead. Abby nodded hastily, biting her bottom lip as she sensed his excitement. "I so want to feel your pleasure," she whispered, her nails raking his shoulders, but her eyes were still closed. For some reason, this made Andy edge even closer, trying to imagine what or who his wife was imagining. After a few moves, Andy let out a ragged moan. They lay there for several minutes, breathing heavily and sweating. Jesus, that felt good. Andy breathed as he rolled onto his back. Abby smiled and stretched languidly, her muscles protesting slightly at the motion. "Yes, how good was that?" she agreed, her voice hoarse from her own screams of pleasure. They lay in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Andy couldn't help but wonder what Abby was thinking during their conversation. Was he driven by the same resentments, or was she thinking about something else entirely? Her body responded in kind, and she was just as vocal as he remembered her, but something was different. It was as if the conversations and provocative images from their conversation with Jenna and Dean had pushed something deep inside her, something primal and unstoppable. Andy couldn't explain it, but as he lay there enjoying the last moments of their pleasure together, he couldn't shake the nagging thought in the back of his mind that his sweet Abby fantasized about someone completely different while they were together. Andy shook his head, trying to shake off the unwanted thoughts and the strange feeling of jealousy that suddenly arose in him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt that their new neighbors were about to change things between them. He had no idea how or when, but Andy couldn't possibly have imagined what impact his neighbors and the evening's events would have in the days to come. PT2 coming soon. Subscribe to our channel so that your second C, Gaff, doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.